Welcome to the Planet Trillion Trees podcast. I'm Eva Monheim.
And I'm Hal Rosner. We are both certified arborists through the International Society of Arboriculture. The purpose of our podcast is to encourage tree planting and proper tree care for our urban forests, which include neighborhoods, parks, and other open spaces.
We will also cover a myriad of tree topics, including the important role trees play in relationship to the climate crisis. Thank you for joining us.
Verdant Earth Educators provides dynamic in-person training and online learning opportunities for environmental and horticultural businesses. Owned by ISA-certified arborists and former university faculty, the Verdant Earth Educator team provides consultations on tree care and recommends climate-resilient opportunities for your valued green spaces. Verdant Earth Educators is all about seeding knowledge for success. Find Verdant Earth Educators at verdanteartheducators.com.
Monheim Microphones designs and handcrafts top-tier studio microphones and preamps right here in the United States in Hollywood, California. Their incredible line of innovative microphones and designs are used around the world by everyone from podcasters to top-charting record producers and singers. They recently released their new royalty microphone, Monheim Microphones Unparalleled Excellence, monheimmicrophones.com. This podcast is being recorded on February 16th, 2024. John Perlin is a professor and visiting scholar in the Department of Physics at University of California, Santa Barbara. He is the author of A Forest Journey, The Role of Trees in the Fate of Civilization. Originally published in 1989, the book's comprehensive coverage of the major role of forests have played in human life earned its recognition as a Harvard classic in science and world history and is one of Harvard's 100 great books. In this latest edition, Perlin cites data on how humanity has cut down half the trees on the planet in the last 12,000 years, and that deforestation continues at an alarming pace with 15 billion trees removed per year. That's 500,000 square miles of forested land lost since the first edition of A Forest Journey was released. Perlin is also the author of 3 other books, A Golden Thread, 2,500 Years of Solar Architecture and Technology, From Space to Earth, The Story of Solar Electricity, and Let It Shine, the 6,000-year story of solar energy. Welcome to the Planet Trillion Trees podcast, John. We're delighted that you could be with us today.
I am happy to be here.
You know, it was just about a year ago that we had you on in February of 2023. We'd love to know what you've been working on since the publication of Forest Journey. It sounds like you've kept yourself busy with some adjacent research.
Yeah, well, one of the questions I asked myself, were the people we call indigenous any different than the, quote, civilized people that most of my book covers? And I discovered some very eye-opening knowledge that I, for one, was sort of unexpectedly to find. One example was the Amazon, where we think of the Amazon as being a perpetual forest. And because I read Spanish, I was able to read called Descubrimiento de las Amazonas by a monk who followed the first voyage from, I believe it was one of the tributaries to the Amazon in either Peru or Ecuador, all the way to the mouth of the Atlantic. And lo and behold, there were millions and millions of people living there at that time, highly civilized people. In fact, they compared the architecture to the Roman antiquities and a landscape that was very different than it is today. And the reason why I can say that very precisely is because I spent several weeks on the Amazon What happened was when you have lots of people use wood to warm themselves, to cook their meals, to build their structures, and the millions of people on the Amazon at that time did so. And for about 100 years, for example, this account of the Amazon, which talked about these large cities and hundreds of thousands of people living by the river, was considered a fable until I think it was in the 1990s, we had breakthroughs in remote sensing where we could see what laid under the trees that had grown since that we thought were, there forever. And lo and behold, this account of the first visit to the Amazon was spot on, because they found, and they're still finding, hundreds of very large communities that are now under the foliage of the great forest.
Well, isn't it a couple of weeks ago, maybe about a month ago, there was a big thing on the news about the discovery of a new city under the forest of the Amazon.
Correct.
And I was really intrigued. I thought, first of all, how did they find it? Number one. Number two, the trees must have grown in very quickly for it to cover over everything that's there.
Well, the one thing you have to understand, and this is what I also learned in my adventures, I spent a lot of time in the Chiapas rainforest and also in the Amazon. I mean, you have so much water pouring down. Like when I was on the Amazon, I think it was between 8 o'clock and noon, there was just what we would consider a deluge. And so once the area got depopulated due to two factors, one was the conquest by the Portuguese, but even more so by the diseases that the native people did not have any defense against. And so you had these huge outbreaks of smallpox, for example. People don't realize that smallpox was like the pandemic we have had with COVID.
Yeah, and last week in the news, they said that there was an outbreak of bubonic plague in Oregon.
I think it's spelled D-E-N-G-U-E, a dengue or something like that. A very terrible virus is breaking out in Brazil right now.
Right. These diseases, they may disappear for a while, but once you start to disturb the natural environment and the animals that live in it, you become exposed to these things that you might not typically be exposed to, and then pick up some type of disease. And it seems like that was what happened in Oregon. It was in a remote area and it was a rodent, and the person caught the bubonic plague. And, how does that happen? Well, we're being exposed to different things that we typically are not being exposed to or were years ago. And now, again, after time, we're being re-exposed to those things.
I don't believe we discussed in our prior conversation was in the book, I discuss how forests serve as the social distancer for a society from COVID. And once we cut down the trees, A, we lost our defense barrier, but two, even worse, because bats were attracted to the lights of the farmers because the lights brought the bugs into a very central location. So they congregate into those areas, being even more successful than they were when they were in the forest. And also you have humans there too for the first time. And so you have a recipe for disaster.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense.
I was going to circle back to that first interview. And one of my takeaways from your book, The Forest Journey, was essentially in my mind, I was perceiving how we're back over on the European side now in terms of the vast amount of basically clear cutting, as you said. And it was such a learning experience for me in terms of fuel and shelter. And I'm wondering if we flip back over to the Amazon, do you have a sense that those civilizations were rampantly clear-cutting as well?
Well, not only they were clear-cutting, but two other aspects. They were burning the forests because they were what we call a maize culture, corn culture.
Okay, corn being their
staple.
Yeah.
And, corn it's really interesting. We had this notion, and I think it was early disinformation by our early political leaders like Thomas Jefferson, that the Indians were these wild animals that had no civilization, when in fact, most of the Indians were sedentary and they were farmers.
You're talking about the indigenous people of North America.
I don't like to use the word indigenous. Like to use the word First Nation because they were immigrants too, but earlier immigrants than we are. And so they weren't like some kind of animals. They were human beings, no different than us. And so they made the same choices. I was just reading today before the show about the Algonquin were a very large group of Indians. They raised corn.
Yeah, that's where they get the three sisters from the Eastern Indians here in our region, like the Lenni Lenape, the corn, the squash, and the beans.
Right. So they were farmers. And because they're human beings, they needed heat during the wintertime because they're not like bears with thick hair. They're human beings. And that's what I've been reading this morning is they had huge fires burning all night in their houses, acting as their clothing during the very cold eastern winters.
But back in the Amazon, I'm assuming the need for fire as heat, wood as a heat source was probably less in demand.
Negligible, but to clear the land for your farm, and this is what they talk in these chronicles that I earlier mentioned, was they mentioned as they were sailing through, they saw I can actually date it, on June 24th, 1540, the fires going to clear the land for growing corn. And I actually experienced this in southern Mexico, where I actually sowed corn with them once the snow left. These are people who lived in very high altitudes. And when the rains came, I was actually out there like throwing seeds out with the people who put me up.
So you were generous and shared with Eva and myself, I guess it's maybe a supplemental chapter where you're talking about, it didn't all begin with the Stone Age. You are circling back and kind of reframing it now and calling it the Wood Age.
Well, actually, I touch on that in the book, but now I've delved much deeper into it. So, for example, I do this occasionally just to reinforce my certainty that I'm on the right track, is take a rock, try to break another rock with it without a handle. And it's very, very, very almost impossible.
And painful.
Right? But if you have a handle, which was wood, and attached to the end was an implement, then you could really go for it. And the reason why we don't have the wood handle, but we have the stone, is because wood tends to deteriorate over the years and stones tend to be pretty solid, right? And so there's a misunderstanding of the whole age before metallurgy that wood was imperative. In fact, this is another part that, and this is in the book, one of the first chapters, is that recently there have been, and this is why it was so good that I got the chance to do a revised edition, is there's so many new discoveries. And one of the big discoveries is discovering what they call hafting. Hafting material is the connection with the rock and the wood. And this actually caused a major revolution in what you might call the Stone Age, because then the implements became much more effective.
And so you're talking about the use of not only that wooden handle, but the pitch coming off maybe a pine of some sort. And I'm assuming a little bit of animal product in the form of leather strapping. I don't want to mispronounce.
Yeah, you got it. You were 100% on spot. So, humans by that time had brains that were very inventive. In fact, unfortunately for the forest, one of the inventions of the, quote, Stone Age was a wooden-handled stone axe. And that came about at least 30,000 years ago with the Neanderthal.
Are you declaring that the Stone Age is actually the Wood Age?
Correct. Because without the wood, there would have been no tools. I mean, they're finding things like, for example, try to cut a slice of meat, for example, with just the blade, and you don't have the wooden handle. It's almost impossible. And once you have the handle and the blade, you're like, off to the races, as they say.
So what if it was called the Wood Stone Age?
Well, you can go for that. I mean, without the wood, humans would have never proliferated, especially when you head north. You really need the calories, and also try to pitch a spear with just the point.
We have some plants here in the east. The one in particular is called arrow wood because the wood is very straight and it's used to make the shafts for arrows.
Correct. So, try to shoot an arrow without the shaft.
Yeah, it's worthless.
Yeah, so, you're coming into, a land of megafauna, huge, huge beasts, and you see all these calories there, and you try to, kill it with just a stone, a sharp stone, forget it. The human evolution would have been abruptly stopped. But if you could stand away, say 10 or 20 yards and, chuck a spear, you got the guy. And in fact, this is a really interesting thing, is that once humans got these implements with wooden shafts, we lose all the big animals throughout the world. And what this caused was great fires, because the herbivores, which were, what people sought after, A, they were great seed spreaders, and B, because they kept down the vegetation, they prevented forest fires.
Yeah, that makes total sense. I was reading something about big animals and people just kill them and kill them and kill them because they had plenty of food. They didn't want to go hungry. They didn't have their, what you would say, the lean part of the year, because they always had these big fat animals around.
Also, there was a lot of waste, because one of the favorite ways of hunting, and this is where wood really plays a role, is fire. So you get guys with torches, right? And you have a cliff and you run those animals off the cliff. You're not counting how many might be wasted. You're counting how easy it is to get all this protein. In fact, the other way they hunted was by burning down the trees, creating a pasture land, and then really having, what do they call it, ducks in a row. It does two things. One, it eases the dangers of hunting because you don't have the obstacles, the trees. And two, you've got a very sedentary and very congregated group of animals, which you can really just annihilate very quickly.
Now, are we still talking about mammoths, or I've lost our...
We're talking about all sorts of large animals.
Okay.
From mammoth to bison.
And we're also talking about a worldwide approach on how some of that hunting was
Do you
done.
realize bison are big guys. They're not little creatures. They're like tractors. I think they weigh several tons, if I'm right.
They're 3,000 to 4,000 pounds. So it would be like 2 tons. 2 tons.
Yeah. So they're big guys. They were like chased, the quote, very environmentally concerned Indians off cliffs in multitudes. And I try to say to people is, don't think of the Indians, think of what the bison think. And the bison were just scared, shitless, right?
Yeah.
As they saw that fire. And fire was only possible, once again, because of wood.
And horses were coming into play as well.
No, that's another fascinating part of it. I love you guys because you're my prompters. So what happened was, it was like a whole new technology where the Spanish brought horses to the New World. And once again, the Indians, being humans, no smarter or dumber than any other humans, recognized a lot easier and quicker way of hunting was through horses, right? And the problem was the horses like to eat the bark and the shoots of trees. And the Indians, because once again, it's like, bringing your Mercedes to the gas pump, they brought the horses to the riparian forest lands to get as much calories so they'll be revved up to go, right, for another hunt.
Just like our deer today do, they graze along the stream banks and cause all kinds of havoc. And that's where the tender, delicious, succulent wood is, because it's young and it's easy to eat and they could eat faster.
Exactly. Like in the Midwest, people talk about, there's nostalgia for the prairies. Well, in fact, in the river areas, there was a great amount of trees, but the trees were fodder for the horses. And I think there's like 3 or 4 aspects that caused the, decline of the buffalo. And one was the horses.
In Kristen Olson's book that we read, and we had her on the podcast, she too had a book published through Patagonia. She was talking with the ranchers to tell them that there were trees here before. You just never saw them because you're too young. If you just move your animals around and keep them in a field to let them graze and not let them go all over the place, you'll have wood and you'll have a forest. And sure enough, the streams and the waterways came back because they started to maneuver their animals in a different way, manage them in a different way, so that they weren't eating everything all over the place. They were eating in one place, cleaning everything up, and then moving them to the next, which makes perfect sense. When they get to the water, they now have water, where before they were losing their water by midsummer. They still have it now because of the way they're grazing. So, that kind of information is pretty profound when you're thinking about, people complaining about not having enough water out west when it's all about management.
Oh, yeah. Earlier you talked about having Dave on the show.
Yeah.
I've been working with Dave actually on this too, is that people, think, was the 19th century the original forest, with the Indians, when in fact, in California, the original forest was primarily pine, but because the California Indians favored oak, because for many uses, the oak, for example, provide a lot of protein from the acorn and also provided material, to make their baskets. So what they did is they burnt all the pine to give the oak an advantage, for their cultural betterment.
Wow.
And also another new discovery that I've been accumulating is in Southern California, we think of the chaparral as the original landscape, but that's not the truth. Is a recent paper in Science where they had, as a control, they had the La Brea tar pits, where, like it's a graveyard of Pleistocene mammals. And also you have Lake Elsinore, where you can gather pollen samples. So what they found was that originally Southern California was a juniper and oak forest until humans came about 10, 11,000 years ago. They burnt down the forest, to hunt. Also, an experience I had in southern Mexico, for example, I was out with some Mayan and we were encamped at night, and suddenly the jaguars started to scream. And so the Mayans suddenly woke up and built a bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger fire, to protect themselves. So that's what the California original people did until they burnt down all of the oak and juniper forests in Southern California. And lo and behold, now we have, as a consequence, the chaparral landscape. So this is something Dave and I have been working with is, you can't think of the forest as a static situation. It changes over time, especially with human intervention.
Yeah, and just to clarify, you've mentioned Dave a couple of times, and you're speaking
Dave
of your Dave Muffley, who's from Berkeley, California.
Well, he actually lives in Santa Barbara now.
Oh, okay. Gotcha. And a recent guest on the Plant a Trillion Trees podcast. We enjoyed having him. So as of this date, Dave's podcast will be out in a couple more weeks.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, we meet every week for lunch and we talk about these ideas. And because I'm at the University of California, I have access to all the journals that Dave wants to, to be of help for his work. And also what was very flattering was he told me that A Forest Journey was what changed him from a automotive engineer to a arborist.
Wow, that's a terrific endorsement right there. Yeah.
Because Dave graduated from Stanford as a automotive engineer.
Yeah.
And in fact, he saved my life last week. I rode my bike down to meet him for lunch. And he looked at my bike and he saw that my automatic derailleur was off. And so he fixed it. And what a valuable lunch.
Yeah, that's great.
Saved your trip to the bike store.
Yeah.
So when you guys meet for lunch, are you just eating big chunks of meat over an open fire? Or
No. It's called the Natural Cafe. And first of all, it allows...
That was my next guess.
Because of COVID, I like to eat outside rather than inside.
Sure.
And so they have those facilities. And also, most of the fare is vegetarian.
Yeah. So, as always, when we're speaking with you, John, it's so eye-opening at many, many different levels. And I guess one thing I am starting to mull around as we play with this word, the Anthropocene, something that's only been in my vocabulary a couple of years. I saw a documentary or two, and, we're wrestling with that. And I guess one of my takeaways now is that humans evolved to the point where they could make a few primitive tools, figure out how to start a fire. And if I'm following you correctly, that's where the degradation began. The Anthropocene started with that first little spark.
Well, actually, what I found really interesting is that, we're one of the great apes, right? That includes chimpanzees and orangutans and gorillas. And what's interesting about great apes, the chimpanzees and the orangutans and the humans, we all began making our shelters out of wood.
Mm-hmm.
Another interesting find that just occurred recently was they found like a wood shaped like Lincoln logs, so they could be pieced together for like a house.
Sure.
Dating to 450,000 years ago by humans. And what's interesting for me is looking at behavior of chimpanzees and orangutans. They do the same thing as they build their shelters for the night in the trees. In fact, this is really crazy. Chimpanzees actually do exactly what the Neanderthals did. They take wood, sharpen the end point, and hunt for small mammals in the Senegal at this moment.
Wow. Well, do you ever think that, and I sometimes roll this around in my head. I hope nobody out there gets upset with me when I say this, but did you ever think that the human species has already peaked and we're going down the other side?
Well, I think we're causing the environment above us to possibly, cause a great change in our situation. And because a lot of people live in urban areas, they don't think of what sustains us.
Mm-hmm.
And what sustains us, and that's why trees are so significant, is first of all, they keep the temperature down by storing the carbon. But more importantly, or as importantly, they create precipitation.
Right.
In fact, 44% of the water of the Nile comes directly from the rainforest of the Congo.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, long before I was interested in trees, I was like traveling around the world, and I was in Tenerife, which is a part of the Canary Islands. And I was eating in a small restaurant, and this farmer told me that since they deforested, this was 50 years ago, that the deforestation really affected the rainfall.
Mm-hmm.
And so this was denied for like decades. And now in the last, I think, 5 or 8 years, we are discovering that not only do trees create rain through evotranspiration, but also they act as relays of rain to very far off places. And so in a very thirsty world, which we already live in, we're really playing with disaster when we start cutting down, the carriers of rain for billions of people.
Well, they're like giant pumps where they're pulling the water out of the ground. And, there's some trees that have the capacity. I think of Perlin all the time because Perlin is a really good example where it can go down as far as it wants to get water, to reach water. It'll go through every little crack, every little nook, any place. And here in the city of Philadelphia, when you see a Perlin tree in the chimney, the root's in the basement of the building, and the building could be 20 stories tall. That root's going to be down there, and that's going to be a takedown because they know that it's already destabilized the building because it's hooking itself into the concrete. So to me, if a tree has that capability of pulling water up, and when it's gone, who's pulling the water up?
Well, none of that. See, what happens is a very interesting operation where the trees pull the water up for photosynthesis.
Right. Yeah.
But because photosynthesis is very inefficient, most of the water goes out to the sky. But that's very fortunate for us because that provides, rain.
Yeah.
And when we remove a water pumper, right, for the planet, it's going to be drier when we do it on a large scale.
Well, it makes sense. And you think about all the trees that when they're grouped together, they seem to function better because they kind of work as a unit. So a forest would be a lot more valuable because of what it can bring as a living organism, as one living organism, and bringing all that up and creating an atmosphere that you wouldn't have anywhere else because those trees are creating the atmosphere.
And I'm working on that right now with the people. See, 10 years ago, it would have been like not believed that trees created precipitation. And 5 years ago, it wouldn't have been believed that trees act as relays for long distance precipitation. And now what's breaking is that trees actually, when they're intact, the forest is intact, they create the air currents for the entire Earth.
That's right.
And so what happens in our folly, because we have this, either it's because we're so alienated from nature, or it's just arrogance, or it's just greed, is we're like cutting our own existence by cutting the trees.
Yes, you're right about that. And, you can take a look at a field after it's been cut down and all the trees are gone, and the nutrient value of that field dissipates very quickly.
Oh, yeah, trees are just incredible. This is the other, trees are just these incredible defenders
Yep.
of the earth from all the erosive forces of the sky. It protects it against the raindrop erosion.
Sure.
Wind erosion,
yep.
and solar erosion.
And then we use leaf blowers.
Exactly.
The reason why I bring that up is I was explaining to somebody in a class that when you have leaves, they're collecting on the surface. They have the charges on them attract the dirt particles, and they sit on those leaves until the end of the season, and then they drop, and they bring all that stuff down without us having to breathe it all in. And then we blow it around. And it kind of doesn't make any sense, because people who don't understand science, they don't really think about it, that we also could be creating diseases that way as well, by using high force wind or action to bring up things from the ground. And it's interesting because we were talking, I can't remember who it was, but the one person said to me, yeah, like you bring up dog poop and you bring up all that kind of stuff off the sidewalk when you use a blower because somebody walked their dog there or they had urinated there, and all that comes up into the air and we're breathing it back in again when it was already down there, quiet, sitting there, waiting for its time to be a nutrient or something. But that's not how we think. And
right. I can't believe you echo all my thoughts and all my you might say peeves.
Hal and I have had a couple people talking about leaf blowers on our show, and it's something that we as humans, if it's faster, it's quicker, it's faster, it's this zhuzh factor, this really loud noise, it's power. It's all about that rather than quiet, settled, docile, that whole thing.
See, one of the nice things about where I live is I can bike like 6 blocks up and be in a incredible oak and sycamore forest. That no houses, just forest, and now a gurgling stream right now.
You're not far from Lotus Land.
I'm talking about actually a wild area.
But I remember driving through the area there.
Yeah, right.
Lotus Land isn't. Right. That's pretty darn nice.
Yeah. Well, you guys are ever in Santa Barbara, I'll take you on a hike. Because I go up and sit among the oaks and sit among the sycamores, listen to the rushing stream, and I'm very content. And I basically learn from just sitting what I have been very focused on. The trees create life. And actually, Archaeopteryx, the first true tree, created our basic geologic modern Earth. In fact, one of the big things in forestry right now is called forests as geoengineers. I don't know if you've been talking about it in your shows.
Forests is they are. They're geoengineers.
Forests is geoengineers,
right.
Because what they do is they change the landscape drastically in favor of life.
But they also change it in a way that makes the Earth's surface softer.
Correct.
It makes it softer so that the sound is baffled. It's like being in a sound studio. When you walk into a forest, you don't hear anything.
Yeah. Well, I do that every day.
Right.
Like about 4:00, I'll get on my bike and go on the trail and commingle with the Pacific live oak. In fact, what's interesting about that tree you were talking about with the deep root?
Yes, Polonia.
That's actually what Dave and I are discussing right now, because with climate change, water is going to get scarcer. And there's an oak that Dave is very interested in. It's called the Engelmann oak.
Yeah, Engelmannii. Yep.
Yeah, you probably discussed that on a show.
Yeah, well, we know it from just being in the business.
Yeah, well, what's really interesting in the oak evolution is that the tap roots, the deeper the tap root of a oak, the more successful it is as the planet warms. And so what Dave is talking about, and I've been talking about, is that we can't think of the forest as being a static, forever landscape. And also, as the climate changes, we have to find trees that will, proliferate in the new environment.
We've played around a little bit, or at least come back to that essential teaching that humans, as they evolved, began to, for better or for worse, exploit resources. One of the things I observe, and I'm sure others have as well, is the new technologies, air quotes, wind and solar in particular, are going to be technologies that don't rely ever so much on fossil fuels.
Well, actually, I don't know if you know this, but I pioneered in solar energy.
Oh, that's right.
Actually, that's one of the reasons I got into writing a forest journey was as I studied solar architecture in antiquity, the reason why they learned how to build with the sun was that they were running out of wood fuel. And so I asked myself if wood fuel was so significant, if trees were so significant because they depended on it as a fuel, as their sole source of fuel, there must be a great story in this. And that's actually the big kicker for me to get into a forest journey was I wrote the first book on the history of solar energy.
Right.
And that kicked me into a forest journey.
So one of the things I learned earlier in the year, just as we have solar panels, what I neglect to think about is the upgrades to the grid. And maybe we could step off and talk a little bit about solar.
Yeah, we can. One of my books on the history of photovoltaics, solar cells, is rated as the number 1 book on solar power. So as we say in Spanish, estoy listo, which means I'm ready.
Okay.
Ask any questions.
Well, I guess it has to do with scaling up. And there's a question that's starting to percolate, like as we shift and pivot over to the new technologies, what does that do for worldwide population growth? Does it level it off? Does it slow it down? Or does it increase it?
In fact, I can answer that question. Okay. Kenya comes to mind. Okay. When people got solar panels, like, in the rural areas of Kenya, actually, a solar panel was more effective as a birth control method than birth control itself.
Oh, my.
Because what it did was it had 2 aspects. It changed the male, instead of like just having, sex, could watch the soccer game because with a solar panel connected to a battery, you had television at night. Number 2, it provided lighting, and the woman could start becoming an economic mover in the family. And so she could say, only if you use contraceptives will I sleep with you.
Okay.
And so actually, Kenya has a very large solarization aspect, and it's been proven to be the most effective birth control.
That's really interesting.
Because it empowers the woman and also gives the male another way of spending his evening.
It's interesting to pursue that, to look at other countries that have also opted on, I guess a couple of the Scandinavian countries, and I believe Chile has really powered themselves with wind technology. I wonder if birth rates are showing up there, or what the data is showing for birth rate.
I think in the Scandinavian countries, they've always had a low birth rate. In fact, I worked in Norway for a couple of years in a different lifetime. I was a longshoreman, and that's what I mean, different profession.
Yeah.
Loading ships, and the families are very small there. But one of the ways of enriching and providing a lot of the needed power, the needed human power is immigration. And that's another issue.
It most definitely is. I mean, we have these, calm, thoughtful conversations, and the backdrop is, so much worldwide chaos. And you can definitely tie it back to issues in and around energy and resources.
Well, resources, and actually I had some special forests that I'd go and visit in Chiapas, and I saw the change from a total forest to a totally denuded area. And at first, the denuded area provided, cornfields.
Mm-hmm.
But soon people didn't realize that it was the forest that made the soil rich.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So after visiting these areas over 20 years, people had to go 6 hours away from their house to start to raise corn. When I first came there, they had the cornfields right by their houses. And actually, the Romans discussed this about how the oak leaves are like the mother of the soil. And so people don't put these things together, that maybe there was a reason the soil was rich before you cut down the trees.
Yesterday we were doing a tree tenders class down in Fairmount Park, and we did the inside class. We did the lecture, my colleague and I, and then we took them out. And there's this not new, but fairly new process when you're pruning to chop and drop and not to take anything back with you. So we were working with young trees, and we were cutting up all the stems. I was showing them how to do it. You cut up all the stems, and then you put it around the base of the tree. And the one gal said to me, "Oh, I get it. We're feeding the tree." And I go, "Precisely."
Yeah, right.
And so it's either wood chips, or you can use the tree's own little branches that you cut up and put around the base of the tree to give it nutrients. But, people don't think, like, where are you going to get your next meal? Do you think about that ahead of time, or do you already have it planned? And a tree provides that steady meal-like quality where you always know where your meal is going to come from.
Well, in so many ways.
Yeah.
First of all, it acts as a home for so many animals.
Right.
And actually, this is how I connect my solar work with trees, is that actually the leaves, act very much like solar panels.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, we only understood how photosynthesis works with Einstein's, I don't know if, are you familiar with the light particle equation?
The equation I'm not, but I've heard of it. Yes.
Okay, what Einstein discovered was that light, in some instances, acts like a particle with energy, and other times acts like a wavelength. And so in photosynthesis, the way a leaf works is an energized particle called the photon excites the chloroplast to begin the chemical reaction that we call photosynthesis.
Right.
In the same way, a solar panel, it doesn't collect the heat of the sun. It collects, once again, the particles that are pure energy. And we use special design materials when those particles hit the panel to move the electrons. And that's what we call electricity.
Mm-hmm.
So actually a leaf, like you look at an oak leaf with all its little veins, doesn't look that much different than a solar panel.
Right. There was a young kid quite a number of years ago who came up with a science fair project, and it was a small little tree that he created out of, I'm not sure what the material was, but it was a replica of a tree that he could use this to power lights. It was like a little tree that acts as a solar panel. And, I always thought about, what if we had these solar panel trees up on our roof? They don't take much room because the panels are constantly moving and they're shifting and changing and collecting light. Is it possible to maximize that light into energy for your house, your home, your car, your truck, whatever it is?
Well, I have to see what they were doing. But the reason why trees are so successful is because they're winning the fight for photons.
Yeah, exactly.
That's why they have climbed up to the sky to maximize the use of photons, just like a solar cell.
And they know how to store it too.
Exactly. That's one thing that the trees have over our present solar technology is they have the storage through chemistry.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's an amazing concoction that began with my favorite tree, Archaeopteris, 380 million years ago.
I wonder if you made a solar cell, like an energy cell to capture the energy, if it was made like a tree trunk with the rings and the radius, then you can actually hold the energy within the context of that.
Well, the trees don't do that. What trees do is they change. It's actually the photons and then the chemical reaction with, as we were talking about,
Right.
the water coming up, that creates chemical changes, and no one has been able yet to copy that in an artificial way.
I think somebody will come up with a way. Somebody who's a tree whisperer, like Hal or somebody.
No, it takes a lot of science, a lot of physics.
Hey, every day we're walking physics.
Physicists.
Yeah, we're actually physics lessons each day. I was telling somebody that the other day. I said, I was telling somebody about a tree, and everything about a tree is physics, and they were like, "Yeah, it is. You're right." And I said, "Well, I was telling that to a physics teacher," and they go, "No, it's not." I go, "Yes."
Well, it's actually about geochemistry.
But it's also about resistant wood, how the wood responds to wind. That's physics.
Yeah, well, actually, that's the story of Archaeopteris. Archaeopteris created, you might say, the idea of tree that never left the planet after that success. Mm-hmm. Even though it became extinct 15 million years later, it created I guess you'd call it the phenotype,
right,
for all future trees.
Yeah.
Basically, it had roots, it had trunk, it had leaves, it had the ability to photosynthesize. And no one understands yet how photosynthesis, the green, the chloroplast came into terrestrial vegetation. That's a real conundrum. Because the first capability was in coral. See, coral has an interesting characteristic where when it can eat food, it doesn't photosynthesize. It doesn't use its chloroplasts. But when it is unable to find food, it has chloroplasts, which provide what they call, you've heard of the word autotroph?
Yeah.
Which creates the autotrophic reaction in the coral. And how that chloroplast came from the sea onto the land is still a mystery.
I want to end, John, with one of my meta questions. Okay. Speaking of extinction, and I'll put it simply.
Okay.
How's this all going to play out?
Oh, I'm no seer, I don't claim to be like Isaiah or... Actually, Isaiah's dream of how this all would play out is the Messiah would come and plant the desert full of trees, and then we would have perpetual water.
They're doing that now.
Yeah.
They're doing that now over in Qatar.
Yeah,
well, maybe we'll end with that answer. I like that.
Yeah, I think it's book 41 of Isaiah, where he says the world is, the peoples are thirsting for water. And God says, I shall plant the cedar, I shall plant the pine in the wastelands, the desert, Hamidbar, which in Hebrew is the wild areas. And actually that area used to be all forest.
Yes.
Right.
So it was just doing a reforestation project.
Let me hit you with one more question, but it's a softball.
Yeah.
If I was to walk into your backyard, would I see a fire pit?
No. Actually, I live in an apartment complex where every day I go out in the common area with my yoga mat and do all my yoga underneath a beautiful, huge pine. And there's about 8 huge pine in the common area that I get to enjoy every day.
Well, anyone that has that kind of opportunity, you've mentioned it a couple times with this interview of your walks and now with yoga. I mean, that is an extraordinary blessing that you have. And, the prayer is that more human beings have that kind of access.
Yeah, so I hope I answered your the Messiah, John Perlin has brought a just and longing environmental peace to the world now.
Well, I think we can agree you're a prophet.
Oh, well, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, this has been very enjoyable. You've made my afternoon.
Right back at you.
Well, take care, John. It was great having you on again. We appreciate it.
Okay, and for the trees, right?
Yep.
Exactly. Yep. We'll see you again.
Yeah, well, thank you so much.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye, John.
The Plant a Trillion Trees podcast is edited by Andromedan Recordings in Hollywood, California.